You think you know history? Think again. For centuries, the narrative has been dominated by kings and conquerors, but what about the queens, the advisors, the strategic masterminds operating just out of sight? Welcome to my channel Words of Time. This video pulls back the curtain on the unsung women who didn't just witness history, they quietly, yet definitively made it happen. Are you ready to meet the real power behind the thrones? You think you know history? Think again. For centuries, the narrative has been dominated by kings and conquerors, but what about the queens, the advisors, the strategic masterminds operating just out of sight? Welcome to my channel Words of Time. This video pulls back the curtain on the unsung women who didn't just witness history, they quietly, yet definitively, made it happen. Are you ready to meet the real power behind the thrones? Throughout history, the story of human civilization has often been told through a narrow lens that privileges certain voices while silencing others. This silence is not accidental. It is a veil woven through time by the structures of power, culture, and tradition that have chosen whose deeds are remembered and whose are forgotten. Behind this veil lie countless women whose ideas, labor, courage, and creativity have shaped societies in ways both subtle and profound. Yet for centuries, their names and legacies were either reduced to footnotes or erased entirely. The tendency to overlook these women does not stem merely from ignorance. It is rooted in a pattern of historical bias that defines what counts as significant and who is worthy of remembrance. To understand why these contributions were hidden, it is essential to look at how history itself has been constructed. The early recorders of events, scribes, philosophers, chroniclers, and later historians, were almost always men writing within patriarchal systems. Their understanding of importance was tied to visible displays of authority. Battles fought, laws written, territories conquered, and wealth accumulated. These were the benchmarks of achievement they recognized, and because women were often excluded from such arenas, they rarely appeared in written chronicles. The domestic, social, and cultural spaces where women exerted influence were deemed secondary or irrelevant. Thus, a skewed version of the past emerged, one that presented power as inherently masculine and relegated female agency to the margins. This distortion has long-lasting consequences. When children learn about great inventors, philosophers, rulers, or reformers, they are usually introduced to male figures. The repetition of these examples reinforces the notion that men are the natural agents of change. Women become the exception, not the rule, and the absence of female role models subtly shapes the imagination of what leadership, intelligence, and creativity look like. The silence, once embedded in the narrative, perpetuates itself generation after generation. Yet history is not a fixed entity. It is a living dialogue between the past and the present, constantly revised as new evidence emerges and old assumptions are questioned. When we peel back the veil of silence, we find that women were never truly absent from history. They were simply hidden within it. From ancient scholars who taught philosophy under male pseudonyms to midwives whose medical knowledge sustained communities, from artists whose works were attributed to their husbands to activists who risked their lives for justice, women have always been there. Their absence in textbooks reflects not their lack of achievement, but the deliberate narrowing of perspective that defines what history considers worthy of record. To challenge this bias, we must begin by rethinking what we mean by power. Traditional narratives equate power with dominance, the ability to command, to conquer, to control. But there exists another kind of power, one that is quieter yet equally transformative. It is the power to nurture, to educate, to connect, and to inspire. Women have often wielded this form of influence, shaping the moral, intellectual, and emotional foundations of their societies. The mother who instills values in her children, the teacher who opens minds to new ideas, the organizer who builds solidarity within her community, all exercise power, though it may not take the form of authority recognized by institutions. This broader understanding of power allows us to see how women's roles have shaped the course of civilization in ways that conventional accounts overlook. Consider how social reforms have often begun in domestic or communal spaces before entering political ones. The fight for education, healthcare, and labor rights, for example, has been led by women who recognize that the private and public are deeply connected. By redefining power as influence rather than control, we gain a more complete understanding of how change truly happens. History becomes less about conquest and more about continuity, less about who ruled and more about who sustained. The persistence of historical bias also reveals something about how societies construct identity. When a culture defines its heroes through male-centered ideals, it teaches everyone, including women, to measure worth according to those same standards. This internalized hierarchy not only limits recognition, but also shapes aspirations. Many women throughout history performed extraordinary feats, but could not claim them because doing so conflicted with the social norms of modesty and obedience imposed upon them. Their talents were redirected or hidden, their inventions attributed to male collaborators, their discoveries dismissed as coincidence. In this way, the suppression of female achievement became self-reinforcing. The fewer women acknowledged in history, the easier it was to justify their exclusion from future opportunities. Recovering these forgotten stories is not simply an act of moral restitution. It is an intellectual necessity. Without them, our understanding of human progress remains incomplete. For instance, in the history of science, the discovery of DNA's structure is inseparable from the work of Rosalind Franklin, whose X-ray images made the breakthrough possible. In literature, countless women wrote under male pseudonyms to have their voices heard. In social reform, women such as Sojourner Truth and Mary Wollstonecraft redefined the moral fabric of their times. These examples remind us that the true story of human achievement cannot be told without the inclusion of women's contributions. Reevaluating the past is also about recognizing the systems that maintained silence. Patriarchal institutions, religion, politics, academia, and even art developed mechanisms to control narrative ownership. The Church canonized certain texts while excluding others. Governments preserved records that supported their legitimacy but ignored dissenting voices. Universities determined whose work was cited and whose was ignored. These gatekeepers of knowledge shaped the collective memory of civilization, and because women were rarely in positions of authority within these systems, their stories often disappeared from the official record. However, silence does not mean absence. Oral traditions, folk songs, letters, diaries, and community archives often preserve what formal history omits. In many cultures, women became the custodians of memory through storytelling, passing down histories that would otherwise be lost. These alternative archives challenge the idea that history must be written to be valid. They reveal a more democratic form of remembering, one that values experience and emotion alongside fact. When scholars today turn to these sources, they uncover rich insights into the social and cultural dimensions of the past that traditional records overlook. The process of reevaluation also invites us to question our definitions of greatness. The obsession with monumental achievements has led us to undervalue the everyday acts that sustain humanity. The woman who kept her family alive through famine, the healer who cared for the sick without recognition, the artist whose work was unsigned but transformative. These are not marginal stories. They are central to the survival and advancement of societies. To overlook them is to misunderstand the nature of progress itself. As we reassess these stories, we confront an uncomfortable truth. The erasure of women from history was not accidental but systemic. It was built into the methods of recording, the criteria of value, and the structures of education. Correcting this imbalance requires more than adding a few female figures to existing narratives. It demands a fundamental shift in how we approach history as a discipline. We must move from asking what happened to who was allowed to be remembered. This shift changes history from a chronicle of events to a study of visibility and silence. The challenge, then, is not only to recover individual stories, but to understand the patterns that caused their disappearance. Each rediscovered woman challenges the myth of male exclusivity in creativity, leadership, and intellect. Each correction reshapes the collective imagination of what humanity is capable of. This is why the work of feminist historians and cultural critics is not merely revisionist, but restorative. They are not rewriting history, they are completing it. In doing so, we also learn to see our present more clearly. The same mechanisms that silenced women in the past still influence how we tell stories today. Media representation, academic recognition, and political discourse continue to privilege certain perspectives. Even as societies make progress toward gender equality, the legacy of exclusion persists in subtle ways. By understanding how the veil of silence was woven, we can better recognize when it reappears in modern forms. Education plays a crucial role in this process. When students are introduced to a wider range of historical figures, they gain a more accurate sense of the world and their place in it. They learn that power can be expressed through compassion as well as command, through collaboration as well as competition. This understanding not only honors the contributions of women, but also expands the possibilities for everyone. By teaching history as a shared human story rather than a record of domination, we cultivate empathy and insight. Moreover, acknowledging overlooked voices enriches every field of knowledge. In science, it challenges us to see collaboration rather than individual genius as the true driver of discovery. In politics, it reminds us that change often begins in grassroots movements rather than formal institutions. In art and literature, it shows how creativity thrives even under constraint. Each rediscovered narrative broadens the map of human potential. This reevaluation also carries an ethical dimension. To ignore the silenced is to accept injustice as natural. To restore their place in history is to affirm that knowledge itself can be an act of equity. When historians, educators, and readers engage with forgotten stories, they participate in a moral project, the pursuit of truth that includes every voice. Such truth-telling does not diminish the achievements of those already recognized. It enhances them by placing them in a fuller context. The process is not simple. Recovering lost histories requires patience, interpretation, and sometimes imagination. Records may be fragmentary, names incomplete, evidence scattered. Yet even these fragments matter. A single letter, a journal entry, or an unsigned painting can open windows into worlds that official histories ignored. Each discovery adds texture to our understanding of the past. The task is ongoing and collective, requiring collaboration between scholars, communities, and institutions. As we bring these stories to light, we must also resist the temptation to romanticize them. The goal is not to idealize women as inherently virtuous or heroic, but to acknowledge their complexity and humanity. They were thinkers, leaders, rebels, and sometimes participants in the same oppressive systems that silenced others. Recognizing their full humanity makes history more honest, not more flattering. It allows us to see patterns of power and resistance without reducing them to moral binaries. In this broader view, the veil of silence becomes both a metaphor and a challenge. It symbolizes the barriers that prevent certain truths from being spoken, but it also reminds us that silence can be lifted. The act of uncovering is itself a form of empowerment. When forgotten voices are heard, they do more than correct the record. They change how we see ourselves. They remind us that progress depends not on erasing difference, but on embracing it. The reevaluation of history is therefore an act of renewal. It invites us to imagine what the world might look like if all contributions were recognized and valued. It teaches us that power is not a zero-sum game. Acknowledging one group's achievements does not diminish another's. Instead, it enriches our collective story, showing how interconnected human progress truly is. The uncovering of forgotten voices leads naturally to those women whose power could not be hidden, who broke through the silence of their time and claimed authority in ways that both challenged and exploited the structures built to exclude them. Their stories remind us that influence and leadership are not the same, and that power, when wielded by women in worlds designed for men, often required a rare combination of vision, calculation, and resilience. Among these figures, three stand out as striking examples of strategic mastery: the Empress Wu Zetian of Tang, China, Catherine the Great of Russia, and Isabella of Castile. Each emerged from a context that sought to confine women to obedience, yet each redefined the boundaries of possibility by understanding her environment better than her rivals did. They were not only products of their times but also architects of them, shaping the course of nations through a blend of intellect, ambition, and adaptability that few of their male counterparts could match. When examining Wu Zetian, one must first understand that her ascent occurred in a culture steeped in patriarchal hierarchy. Tang, China, one of the most sophisticated civilizations of its era, still regarded political authority as a male prerogative. For a woman to reach the imperial throne required more than mere inheritance or luck. It demanded strategic genius. Wu Zetian began her journey as a concubine to Emperor Taizong and, after his death, entered a Buddhist convent, seemingly resigned to obscurity. Yet through a combination of intelligence, charisma, and an acute reading of court politics, she re-emerged within the palace of the next ruler, Emperor Gaozong. She gained his trust and affection, but what truly set her apart was her understanding of the machinery of power. She observed how court factions operated, how ministers aligned themselves with interests, and how imperial authority was sustained by narrative as much as by decree. When illness weakened the emperor, She positioned herself as both his partner and protector of stability. Her decisions were calculated not only to strengthen her own position, but to present her leadership as an extension of order itself. By aligning her rule with Buddhist symbolism and invoking the mandate of heaven, she justified what would otherwise have been seen as heresy, a woman claiming the dragon throne. Her reign, though often described by chroniclers as ruthless, brought significant administrative reform. She promoted scholars based on merit rather than lineage, reduced corruption, and emphasized the moral responsibilities of governance. These actions were not acts of benevolence alone, but strategic investments in legitimacy. Wu Zetian understood that power needed both fear and respect. Her suppression of opposition, though severe, ensured stability in a vast empire that might otherwise have descended into chaos. She also recognized the importance of narrative control, commissioning historians and poets to frame her leadership as divinely ordained. The irony is that the same record keepers later vilified her, turning her story into a cautionary tale about female ambition. Yet even through their attempts to diminish her, her legacy endured, for history could not entirely conceal the scale of her achievement. She was the only woman in Chinese history to rule in her own name, and she did so not by subverting power, but by mastering its language. If Wu Zetian demonstrated how intelligence and ruthlessness could secure authority within a rigid hierarchy, Catherine the Great showed how vision and adaptability could transform a distant European empire into a center of cultural and political influence. Born a minor German princess, she arrived in Russia as a teenage bride to the future Emperor Peter III. The Russian court was a labyrinth of intrigue, suspicion, and shifting loyalties. Catherine learned quickly that survival depended on knowledge of people, of politics, and of perception. Her husband's erratic behavior and unpopularity created an opening, but taking advantage of it required both courage and planning. Through careful alliances with key military and political figures, Catherine orchestrated a coup that deposed her husband and placed her on the throne. Unlike many usurpers, she immediately grasped that sustaining power required legitimacy beyond the sword. She immersed herself in Enlightenment thought, corresponding with philosophers such as Voltaire and Diderot, and positioning herself as an enlightened monarch who ruled for the welfare of her people. This alignment with intellectual progress not only enhanced her image abroad, but also gave her reign ideological coherence. She pursued legal reform, attempted to modernize the administration, and expanded education, particularly for women of the nobility. Yet Catherine's enlightenment was as pragmatic as it was philosophical. She understood that ideals without control could be dangerous. While she embraced the language of liberty, she maintained an autocracy strong enough to suppress rebellion. Her expansion of the empire through wars against the Ottoman Empire and the annexation of Crimea demonstrated her strategic acumen. She recognized that Russia's survival and influence depended on access to warm water ports and control over its borders. Every diplomatic maneuver and military campaign was calculated to enhance not only territorial security, but also prestige. Catherine's court became a hub of European culture. She sponsored the arts, commissioned architecture that symbolized progress, and turned St. Petersburg into a display of Russian sophistication. Her reign was not without contradiction. She espoused Enlightenment ideals while presiding over a society built on serfdom, but within those contradictions lay her genius. She managed to hold together a vast empire, balance reform with tradition, and maintain her image as both ruler and patron of civilization. Like Wu Zetian, she controlled narrative as much as policy. Her letters, portraits, and public projects all reinforced the idea of a woman uniquely destined to lead. Her strength lay in her ability to translate personal ambition into a national vision. While Wu Zetian and Catherine the Great navigated the complexities of imperial courts, Isabella of Castile wielded power through partnership and faith. Her ascent took place in a Europe fragmented by rival kingdoms and religious strife. From an early age, Isabella faced obstacles that would have deterred many. Her claim to the throne was contested, her marriage politically charged, and her ambitions limited by gender. Yet she possessed a clear sense of purpose: to unify Spain under stable rule and shared belief. Her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon was not merely romantic, but strategic, creating the foundation for the unification of Castile and Aragon into what would become modern Spain. Isabella's reign is often remembered for two monumental undertakings: the completion of the Reconquista and the sponsorship of Christopher Columbus's voyage. Both decisions reveal her vision of power as a tool for consolidation, of territory, faith, and identity. The Reconquista, which ended centuries of Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula, was framed as a divine mission to restore Christian unity. In this, Isabella's piety served as both conviction and political weapon. She used religion to bind her kingdom together, to justify expansion, and to define loyalty. Her reforms of the clergy and the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition are often viewed with moral complexity today, but in her own context, they reflected her determination to align belief with governance. Her support for Columbus, meanwhile, displayed both boldness and foresight. When most of Europe dismissed the Genoese navigators' plans as folly, Isabella saw in them an opportunity to extend Spanish influence beyond the known world. Her decision to finance the expedition reshaped global history, linking continents and setting in motion centuries of exploration and exchange. It also revealed her understanding of power, not merely as control over land, but as the creation of legacy. Isabella recognized that true authority lies in shaping the future, not just ruling the present. In domestic affairs, she strengthened the monarchy by reducing the power of unruly nobles and reforming the legal system. She emphasized education, supported the translation of classical texts, and promoted the idea that moral virtue was essential to governance. Like Wu Zetian and Catherine, Isabella combined conviction with calculation. Her sense of divine purpose coexisted with an acute awareness of political necessity. She balanced compassion with firmness, presenting herself as both mother and monarch to her people. When viewed together, these three women demonstrate that power has many languages. Wu Zetian spoke in the language of order and destiny, Catherine in the dialect of reason and reform, Isabella in the tone of faith and unity. Their contexts differed, yet their methods shared a common insight, that authority is not seized once but maintained through constant adaptation. Each faced opposition rooted in gender, and each transformed that limitation into a source of strength. Their intelligence lay not only in strategy but in perception, the ability to read the currents of their societies and turn them to their advantage. Their reigns also exposed the tension between morality and necessity. Wu Zetian's ruthlessness, Catherine's contradictions, and Isabella's zeal reveal the costs of leadership in any age. To survive as women in systems designed to exclude them, they had to wield power as men did, sometimes more ruthlessly. Yet their legacies endure not because of their cruelty or cunning, but because of what they achieved within impossible constraints. They prove that leadership is not defined by gender, but by vision and will. The traditional portrayal of these rulers has often been colored by bias. Wu Zetian was depicted as a seductress who usurped a sacred throne, Catherine as a libertine who ruled through manipulation, Isabella as a fanatic blinded by faith. Such depictions reveal more about the prejudices of historians than about the women themselves. Each was judged not only by her actions, but by the discomfort she caused in a world unprepared for female sovereignty. The same traits that would be praised in male rulers, decisiveness, ambition, intelligence, were recast as dangerous or unnatural in women. In reclaiming their stories, we must strip away the distortions imposed by centuries of moralizing and recognize them as leaders who reshaped the course of history. Their achievements also challenge the notion that women's influence is confined to the private or cultural sphere. Wu Zetian redefined imperial administration, Catherine expanded an empire's frontiers, and Isabella united a kingdom and opened a new world. Their power was not symbolic, it was concrete, measurable in laws enacted, territories gained, and institutions founded. Yet they also understood the symbolic dimension of rule, the need to embody ideals that would outlast their lifetimes. In this sense, they were as much architects of meaning as of policy. The lessons their lives offer extend beyond gender. They remind us that power, when divorced from empathy, becomes tyranny, but when combined with vision, it becomes transformative. Each of these rulers used the tools available to her not only to survive, but to shape a legacy that redefined her nation's identity. Their leadership demonstrates that strength and intellect, when guided by purpose, can transcend the boundaries imposed by tradition. As we look back, it becomes clear that the stories of Wu Zetian, Catherine the Great, and Isabella of Castile are not isolated tales of exceptional women, but integral chapters in the history of human governance. Their reigns bridge the gap between the hidden influence of women in private life and the visible authority of women in public power. They are the link between the silent contributions explored earlier and the audible assertion of female leadership that followed. Through them, the thread of history continues unbroken, showing that the veil of silence can be lifted not only through remembrance but through action. Their lives invite reflection on the present as well. The challenges they faced, doubt, scrutiny, the need to balance principle with pragmatism, remain familiar to any leader today. Their example teaches that progress is rarely linear, that power always carries moral complexity, and that true leadership lies in the ability to shape destiny without losing humanity. By understanding their struggles, we gain insight into the broader patterns of history, how societies evolve, how prejudice endures, and how courage can transform both. In this light, the whispers of power that once echoed in palace corridors become part of a larger conversation about agency and memory. These women, through intellect and will, turned whispers into commands, and commands into legacies that still resonate centuries later. Their reigns remind us that history, when told in full, is neither a tale of men nor of women alone, but a record of human determination. Each of them, in her own way, dismantled the boundaries of what was deemed possible. And so, as the silence of forgotten women gives way to the voices of those who ruled, the continuum of history grows clearer. Power, once thought to belong to a single gender, reveals itself as a shared human pursuit expressed in myriad forms. The stories of Wu Zetian, Catherine the Great, and Isabella of Castile stand not apart from, but within the grand narrative of civilization. They are proof that the history of leadership, like the history of humanity, is incomplete without them. Their legacy invites us to keep looking beyond the surface, to listen for the voices still unheard, and to remember that every act of recognition is an act of restoration. The past, when fully told, is not a monument but a living mirror, reflecting both the continuum of power shaped by women across centuries does not end with those who wore crowns in their own right. Beyond the visible thrones were others who ruled through persuasion, strategy, and intellect, often without the full recognition their influence deserved. These were women who understood that authority need not always be declared to be real. They worked within the limits imposed upon them, bending those limits until they became tools of command. Their mastery lay not only in seizing opportunity, but in creating it where none seemed to exist. In the complex theaters of empire and monarchy, they stood behind the curtains of public authority, yet directed the drama unfolding before the world. Among them were Empress Theodora of Byzantium, Agrippina the Younger of Rome, and Queen Elizabeth I of England. Each wielded her own form of power, sometimes overt, often invisible, but always decisive in shaping the destinies of empires. To speak of Theodora is to speak of a transformation that defied the rigid hierarchies of her age. Born into modest circumstances, she rose through intelligence, charisma, and an unyielding will to become the consort and partner of Emperor Justinian, one of the most influential rulers of Byzantium. Her ascent was nothing short of remarkable in a society that viewed women, particularly those from humble origins, as incapable of governance. Yet Theodora possessed an instinct for politics that rivaled, and in moments of crisis, surpassed that of her husband. Her partnership with Justinian was one of the most consequential alliances in imperial history, blending his legal and administrative genius with her political intuition and psychological insight. Her influence became most visible during the Nika riots, a rebellion that threatened to bring down the empire. As chaos engulfed Constantinople, Justinian considered fleeing the capital to save his life. Theodora, however, refused to yield to fear. Her words, recorded by chroniclers, reveal a mind both practical and resolute. She reminded her husband that imperial dignity, once lost, could never be restored, declaring that she would rather die wearing the crown than live in exile. It was not mere defiance, it was strategy. She understood that leadership required both courage and appearance. By standing firm, she transformed hesitation into resolve. Her determination galvanized the court and the military, leading to the suppression of the revolt and the preservation of Justinian's rule. Without her intervention, the Byzantine Empire might have fractured in that moment. Theodora's political acumen extended beyond crisis management. She was deeply involved in policy, particularly in matters of law and social welfare. Her advocacy for women's rights was revolutionary for its time. She supported legislation protecting women from exploitation, expanded the rights of divorce, and improved conditions for former courtesans, reflecting empathy rooted in her own experiences. Yet even this compassion served a political purpose. By aligning moral reform with imperial authority, she reinforced the perception that the empire's strength lay in justice and mercy. She shaped not only policy but perception, blending morality and power in a manner that elevated both her husband's reign and her own legacy. Her understanding of influence was subtle but enduring. Theodora recognized that authority could manifest through counsel as effectively as through command. While Justinian wrote laws and built monuments, she built alliances, ensuring that the human machinery behind the empire remained loyal and stable. When later historians attempted to diminish her by focusing on her past, they inadvertently confirmed her significance. Only those who matter deeply provoke such enduring attempts at defamation. Through her, the idea of partnership and power gained a new dimension, one in which intellect and resolve could outweigh birth and tradition. If Theodora's power was defined by partnership, Agrippina the Younger's was forged in the shadows of ambition and survival within the perilous corridors of imperial Rome. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was a web of intrigue, and Agrippina understood from birth that survival depended on strategy. As the sister of Caligula, the niece of Emperor Tiberius, and later the wife of Emperor Claudius, she lived at the center of an empire where proximity to power was both privilege and danger. In this treacherous environment, she mastered manipulation not out of cruelty but necessity. To endure in a world that routinely consumed its own elites required foresight sharper than any blade. Her most audacious act was the orchestration of her son Nero's succession to the throne. Through calculated alliances and the careful elimination of rivals, she positioned herself as indispensable to Claudius. By marrying him, she united two branches of the imperial family and secured Nero's adoption as his heir. Her influence over Claudius was profound. She participated in state councils, received foreign delegations, and even appeared on coinage alongside her husband, an unprecedented honor that revealed both her power and her ability to shape her own image. When Nero ascended to the throne, Agrippina sought to govern through him, believing that maternal guidance would ensure both stability and her own security. For a time, her plan worked. She served as the unseen architect of the early years of his reign, shaping policy and controlling access to the emperor. Yet power shared as power contested. As Nero matured, tension grew between mother and son. Agrippina's influence, once essential, became a threat. The political struggle that followed revealed the fragility of power that depends on proximity rather than position. Eventually, Nero turned against her, and her death was as dramatic as her life. Agrippina's story is often told as a tale of corruption and ambition, but beneath the layers of moral judgment lies a clearer truth. She understood the system she inhabited and used it with precision. Her intelligence and audacity exposed the contradictions of Roman patriarchy. An empire that celebrated female divinity in its myths yet feared female agency in its politics. Agrippina's ambition was no greater than that of the men around her. It was simply less forgivable. By asserting authority within a structure designed to exclude her, she revealed the limits of that structure itself. Her legacy, though tarnished by ancient historians eager to vilify her, survives as a testament to the dangers and possibilities of navigating power from the margins. Centuries later, another woman would demonstrate that control could be maintained not through marriage or manipulation, but through abstention. Queen Elizabeth I of England, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, inherited a kingdom fraught with division and distrust. Religion, politics, and gender all conspired to make her reign precarious before it even began. Her legitimacy was questioned, her faith scrutinized, and her capacity to rule doubted in a world that viewed women as unfit for sovereignty. Yet Elizabeth turned these disadvantages into instruments of rule, using perception as deftly as policy. Her decision to remain unmarried became the cornerstone of her political identity. In an age when royal marriages were expected to secure alliances and produce heirs, her refusal was radical. She declared herself married to her kingdom, transforming personal restraint into a symbol of national unity. This so-called virgin policy was not a denial of human desire, but a calculated strategy. Marriage to any prince, domestic or foreign, would have divided her realm, placing her under the influence of competing powers. By staying single, she remained above faction, an embodiment of stability in a volatile time. Her unmarried status became both shield and weapon. Elizabeth's mastery of statecraft extended far beyond personal symbolism. She surrounded herself with capable advisors, but ensured that final authority always rested with her. Her intelligence, wit, and command of rhetoric made her a formidable presence in diplomacy. She played rival factions against each other, keeping nobles loyal by balancing reward and fear. Under her reign, England navigated religious conflict, resisted foreign invasion, and fostered a cultural renaissance that produced figures such as Shakespeare and Marlowe. Her greatest test came with the threat of Spanish invasion. The Spanish Armada, launched under Philip II, sought to overthrow her and restore Catholic dominance in England. Elizabeth met the crisis not with panic, but with poise. Her speech to the troops at Tilbury remains one of history's most powerful moments of leadership. Standing before her soldiers in armor, she declared that though she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, she possessed the heart and stomach of a king. In that moment, she unified her nation not through command, but through example. Her words transformed vulnerability into strength, embodying the very principle that had guided her reign, authority rooted in self-mastery. Elizabeth's use of image and identity was as strategic as any military campaign. Portraits, pageants, and poetry all reinforced her mythic persona, the Virgin Queen, chosen by divine providence to guide England. This cultivated image served political purpose, ensuring loyalty and discouraging challenges to her authority. Like Theodora and Agrippina, she understood that power required both substance and spectacle. Yet unlike them, she mastered the balance between visibility and restraint, maintaining control without overreach. Her reign marked one of the most stable and prosperous periods in English history, proving that wisdom and patience could achieve what conquest and coercion often failed to secure. Together, Theodora, Agrippina, and Elizabeth illustrate the many forms that unseen power can take. Each navigated a world that sought to define her by gender and turned that definition into advantage. Theodora transformed partnership into parity, Agrippina turned ambition into strategy, and Elizabeth made solitude a symbol of sovereignty. Their stories reveal that influence often operates most effectively when it is not fully acknowledged. By working within systems that underestimated them, they gained the freedom to act without constant scrutiny. Their lives also challenge the boundaries of moral interpretation. History often labels women who seek power as manipulative, while celebrating men who do the same as decisive. Yet these rulers demonstrate that the pursuit of authority, when guided by intellect and purpose, is not a flaw but a form of courage. They remind us that leadership requires more than virtue. It requires vision, and vision often demands defiance. The connection between these figures and those who came before them lies in continuity of struggle and strategy. From Wu Zetian's consolidation of imperial China to Catherine's transformation of Russia and Isabella's unification of Spain, the thread of female agency winds through history, sometimes visible, sometimes concealed. Theodora, Agrippina, and Elizabeth represent the evolution of that agency from participation to manipulation to mastery. Each confronted the same fundamental question: how does one rule in a world that refuses to acknowledge one's right to rule? Their answers, though distinct, converge in their refusal to accept limitation as destiny. Their influence also extends beyond their lifetimes. Theodora's example shaped later Byzantine empresses who wielded considerable power in the empire's politics and culture. Agrippina's audacity set a precedent for women in imperial Rome who learned to navigate the dangerous balance between visibility and survival. Elizabeth's model of governance inspired generations of queens and stateswomen, from the 18th century monarchs who adopted her image of restraint to modern leaders who still draw upon her rhetoric of strength through composure. In reflecting on their legacies, it becomes clear that the unseen hand of power often leaves the most enduring marks. The laws Justinian reformed, the emperors Agrippina influenced, and the empire Elizabeth fortified all bear the imprint of female intellect operating within systems of male authority. Their methods differed, but their purpose was shared: to shape events rather than merely witness them. They turned circumstance into opportunity, and in doing so, they altered the trajectory of history itself. The lessons drawn from their lives resonate with the same truth that guided earlier reflections: that history's completeness depends on recognizing every dimension of human influence. To study these women is to understand that power is not a fixed structure, but a fluid exchange of perception, persuasion, and persistence. Theodora, Agrippina, and Elizabeth mastered this exchange, proving that leadership is not the privilege of gender, but the reward of understanding. Their stories also remind us that the veil of silence once pulled over women's achievements was not only unjust but inaccurate. The empire, the court, and the kingdom each bore witness to a form of rule that was both strategic and compassionate, pragmatic and visionary. Their legacies compel us to listen more carefully to the echoes that history has long muffled, the whispers that shaped empires, guided kings, and defined nations. As this exploration continues from the hidden to the visible, from silence to sovereignty, the line between influence and command fades. Power, in all its forms, is neither male nor female. It is human, shaped by intellect, tempered by experience, and measured by its capacity to endure. Theodora, Agrippina, and Elizabeth remind us that even behind the most imposing thrones, there has always been an unseen hand, steady, deliberate, and indispensable to the making of history. The story of women's power does not end with crowns, councils, or empires. Beyond thrones and battlefields lies another realm where influence is measured not in armies or laws, but in the shaping of thought, art, and imagination. Cultural architects, those who mold the spirit of their age, often wield a form of power more enduring than conquest. Their creations reshape how people see the world and themselves. Through words, ideas, and the pursuit of knowledge, they change the course of civilization from within. In the continuum of history, after the empresses and queens who ruled through policy and presence, there stand women whose legacies reign through intellect and creativity. Their power was expressed not in decrees but in expression, not in territory but in timeless influence. Among them, Murasaki Shikibu of Japan, Hypatia of Alexandria, and Sappho of Lesbos embody the enduring strength of the mind and the imagination. Each, in her own way, constructed a world that redefined the boundaries of culture, leaving behind works that outlived dynasties and empires. Murasaki Shikibu lived in the Heian court of Japan during a time when art and refinement defined status as much as lineage or wealth. The Heian period was a world of delicate hierarchies, where the exchange of poems could carry as much weight as political alliances. It was also a society that, though restrictive to women in public life, allowed them a certain freedom in literature. Men often wrote in Chinese, the language of scholarship and government, while women wrote in the Japanese syllabary, using it to capture the nuances of emotion and everyday experience. Within that linguistic divide, Murasaki found a space to create something extraordinary. Her masterpiece, The Tale of Genji, is not only the world's first psychological novel, but also one of the most sophisticated explorations of human nature ever written. Through the story of Prince Genji, she wove a tapestry of courtly life filled with beauty, longing, and impermanence. Her writing reflected not just the aesthetics of her time, but the deep undercurrents of human emotion that transcend centuries. In her depiction of relationships, politics, and the fleeting nature of happiness, she revealed an understanding of humanity that rivals any philosopher. The Heian court, with its rituals, poetry contests, and subtle rivalries, became both her subject and her stage. Her prose, infused with poetic grace, created an entire cultural framework that influenced Japanese art, aesthetics, and literature for generations. What makes Murasaki's work revolutionary is not only its artistry, but its perspective. She wrote from within a world where women were expected to remain silent observers, yet she made observation itself a form of power. Through her characters, she examined the constraints of gender and the fragility of privilege with a precision that feels modern even today. She demonstrated that narrative could be an act of defiance, a way to speak truth in a world that prized restraint. Her tale of Genji became more than entertainment. It became a mirror for society, reflecting its virtues and vanities alike. The beauty of her writing lay in its subtlety, in the unspoken truths that lingered between lines. Murasaki's influence extended far beyond her own era. The tale of Genji shaped Japanese identity, inspiring painters, poets, and dramatists for centuries. The aesthetic ideal known as mono no aware, the gentle awareness of life's transience, owes much to her vision. In a world where history often celebrates the builders of empires, Murasaki built an empire of imagination. Her pen became her throne, and her legacy, though written in delicate brushstrokes, proved more enduring than stone. Where Murasaki shaped the inner world of emotion and art, Hypatia of Alexandria represented the pursuit of reason and knowledge. Living in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, she occupied one of history's most perilous intersections, a time when the ancient world's reverence for philosophy collided with the rise of new religious orthodoxy. As a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher, Hypatia stood as the last great light of the Alexandrian intellectual tradition, the inheritor of centuries of Greek thought. Her presence in the scholarly world was a challenge to her society's expectations, for she was a woman teaching men in the great halls of learning, a figure of both admiration and controversy. Her intellect drew students from across the Mediterranean. She lectured on the works of Plato and Aristotle, on geometry and astronomy, on the mysteries of the cosmos and the discipline of logic. Yet Hypatia's true power lay not merely in her mastery of knowledge, but in her embodiment of it. She represented the ideal of the philosopher as seeker of truth, undaunted by convention. Her calm authority, her refusal to compromise her principles, and her devotion to inquiry made her both revered and feared. Alexandria in her lifetime was a city of tension, torn between pagan traditions and the growing dominance of Christianity. Hypatia's position as a pagan philosopher and advisor to political leaders made her a target of suspicion. Her tragic death at the hands of a mob has often been recounted as a symbol of the conflict between faith and reason, but her legacy is greater than her martyrdom. She stands as a testament to the resilience of the human mind and the courage required to pursue truth in the face of dogma. Hypatia's contributions to mathematics and philosophy, though largely preserved through the writings of her students, shaped the intellectual currents of later centuries. She refined instruments used to measure celestial movements and contributed to the preservation and interpretation of classical works that might otherwise have been lost. Her influence endured in the transmission of knowledge through the Arab and Byzantine scholars who later carried the torch of ancient science. More profoundly, her life represents the moment when the pursuit of understanding became an act of resistance. In Hypatia, we see the intersection of intellect and integrity, the understanding that knowledge without moral courage is incomplete. She navigated the same currents of power that defined the rulers of her age, but her domain was the mind rather than the state. Like Theodora's political wisdom or Elizabeth's statecraft, Hypatia's brilliance was a form of leadership. She commanded not through authority but through respect, her classroom serving as her court, her ideas as her edicts. Her death marked not the end of her influence, but the beginning of her transformation into legend, a reminder that even when silenced, the voice of reason continues to echo through time. If Murasaki shaped emotion and Hypatia reason, then Sappho of Lesbos embodied the language of the soul. Writing more than 6 centuries before the Common Era, she created poetry that remains among the most intimate and enduring expressions of human feeling. In an age when most surviving literature celebrated war, heroism, and divine power, Sappho turned her gaze inward, writing of love, desire, friendship, and loss. Her verses transformed the landscape of Greek poetry, shifting it from the epic grandeur of Homer to the personal resonance of lived experience. She gave lyric poetry its name, for her songs were composed to be sung with the lyre, each word shaped by rhythm and melody. Sappho's genius lay in her ability to universalize the private. She wrote of longing so vividly that centuries later, her fragments still evoke the pulse of human emotion. Her words transcended gender, capturing feelings that belong to all who have loved or grieved. Yet her voice was distinctly feminine, not because it spoke of women, but because it spoke from the truth of experience often excluded from the male-dominated literary canon. In doing so, she expanded the definition of what poetry could express. Her influence was immense. Ancient critics ranked her alongside Homer as one of the greatest poets of Greece. Plato called her the 10th muse, a divine figure among mortals. Yet, like so many women of genius, her work survived only in fragments, scattered across time. The loss of her complete poems is one of history's great silences, yet even in fragments, her voice remains whole. Her lines, delicate yet powerful, continue to shape the language of love in literature around the world. The intimacy she created between poet and reader anticipated the modern understanding of art as personal connection. Sappho's poetry also holds philosophical depth. Beneath the beauty of her words lies a meditation on impermanence, the fleeting nature of passion and life. In this sense, she shares a kinship with Murasaki across centuries and continents. Both captured the bittersweet awareness of time's passage, turning transience into art. Sappho's ability to articulate emotion with precision and grace became a foundation for all lyric poetry that followed. Her influence extends from the odes of Horace to the sonnets of Shakespeare and beyond, proving that the heart's truths endure where empires crumble. Together, Murasaki, Hypatia, and Sappho represent 3 dimensions of cultural power: the emotional, the intellectual, and the expressive. Each operated in a different world, Heian Japan, late antique Alexandria, and archaic Greece. Yet all shared the courage to create meaning in spaces where women's voices were seldom heard. They did not lead armies or rule kingdoms, yet their influence shaped civilizations as profoundly as any monarch or general. Their legacies reveal that culture itself is a form of empire, built not of stone but of symbols, not of conquest but of creation. Their achievements also illustrate that the boundaries of power are broader than politics. Murasaki's narrative art reshaped social consciousness, Hypatia's philosophy preserved the pursuit of truth, and Sappho's poetry gave language to the deepest recesses of the human heart. In them, we see how creativity becomes a form of resistance. Each used her gifts to assert autonomy in worlds that sought to confine her. Murasaki wrote within the court, but beyond its control. Hypatia taught within institutions that feared her intellect, yet could not dismiss her. Sappho sang in a tradition that celebrated heroes but found room, at least briefly, for the tenderness of human experience. The thread connecting these women to those who came before is unbroken. Like Wu Zetian, they redefined what authority could mean. Like Catherine and Isabella, they understood that vision endures longer than command. Like Theodora and Elizabeth, they proved that influence can thrive even without formal power. The evolution from queens to creators completes the portrait of women's agency across time. What began as the struggle to be seen becomes, in these cultural architects, the mastery of being heard. Their stories also underscore the fragility of memory. For every Murasaki, Hypatia, or Sappho whose name survives, countless others remain unrecorded. The preservation of their legacies depended on chance, translation, and the willingness of later generations to listen. Yet their survival, however partial, demonstrates that true creativity transcends the limits of time and circumstance. Their works remind us that history is not only a record of what was built, but of what was imagined. In reflecting on them, one sees how the forms of power explored across these narratives, political, intellectual, emotional, are not separate but interconnected. The ruler, the philosopher, and the poet all shape the world in different languages. One governs the body of the state, another the mind, and the third the spirit. Murasaki's prose deepened empathy, Hypatia's logic strengthened inquiry, and Sappho's verse illuminated emotion. Together, they show that the greatest revolutions often begin not in battle, but in thought. Their influence endures precisely because it cannot be confined to a single era. Murasaki's insights into the human condition speak to readers across cultures. Hypatia's courage in defending reason continues to inspire scientists and scholars who face opposition for their ideas. Sappho's celebration of love and identity resonates with those who seek authenticity in a world that still wrestles with conformity. Each woman, in her own way, continues to remind us that creation is the highest form of defiance and understanding the truest expression of strength. The legacies of these cultural architects invite us to reconsider what history values. Monuments decay, empires fade, but words and ideas endure. Through them, we see that power need not be loud to be lasting. Murasaki's quiet observation, Hypatia's calm reasoning, and Sappho's lyrical voice form a triad of influence that continues to echo through literature, philosophy, and art. Their contributions challenge the notion that history's greatest achievements belong solely to those who commanded armies or crowns. Instead, they reveal that the shaping of thought and emotion is as essential to humanity as the shaping of nations. As the narrative extends from rulers to writers, from sovereigns to scholars, it becomes clear that the true measure of civilization lies not only in what it conquers, but in what it understands. The women who created, taught, and sang expanded that understanding, ensuring that the legacy of humanity would be not merely a chronicle of power, but a dialogue of the mind and the heart. Through them, the silence of forgotten women becomes the music of remembered voices, and the story of history becomes, at last, complete. The resonance of their lives does not fade with the passing of centuries. The women who shaped art, intellect, and power through courage and imagination did more than change the past. They continue to define how we see strength today. Their echoes are everywhere, woven into the fabric of modern thought, leadership, and creativity. The stories of Murasaki Shikibu, Hypatia of Alexandria, and Sappho of Lesbos, alongside the rulers and strategists who came before them, remind us that history is not only a record of what has happened, but also a living conversation that still evolves. The influence of these women continues to ripple outward, shaping how we understand authority, empathy, and the meaning of influence in an age that still struggles to recognize it fully. Their impact endures because it exists beyond the limitations of time or geography. The quiet wisdom of Murasaki's writing, the intellectual defiance of Hypatia, and the emotional candor of Sappho each speak to different aspects of leadership and self-expression that modern society continues to explore. In many ways, they anticipated the challenges that still confront women today. The balance between visibility and vulnerability, between independence and acceptance, between ambition and expectation. The power of their legacies lies not only in what they achieved, but in how they achieved it, with patience, intellect, and a profound awareness of the world around them. Their strategies remain relevant in a time when gender inequality persists in subtler, but no less real forms. The enduring influence of these figures reveals that leadership is not confined to command. It can be expressed through the ability to inspire thought, to move others through example, and to sustain principles despite opposition. In the modern age, leadership often presents itself as innovation, empathy, or vision, the same qualities embodied by these women long before such terms were celebrated. Murasaki's narrative sensitivity can be seen in the modern understanding that emotional intelligence is as essential as logic in guiding people. Hypatia's fearless pursuit of knowledge without submission to authority reflects the values of critical thinking, scientific integrity, and intellectual freedom that define education and discovery today. Sappho's lyrical honesty anticipates the belief that authenticity and vulnerability are strengths, not weaknesses, in communication and art. The connection between their work and modern thought becomes clear when one considers how society continues to grapple with the definition of influence. In business, politics, and culture, women often face the same challenge these historical figures confronted: to assert authority without being defined by it, to lead without abandoning empathy, and to innovate without erasing identity. The lessons of the past illuminate a path forward. Each of these women found ways to operate within restrictive systems, turning boundaries into creative opportunities. They show that transformation often begins not with rebellion, but with subtle redefinition, from within the structures that seek to contain it. Modern leaders who embrace collaboration over domination, who value empathy as a foundation of strength, and who elevate the collective above personal gain embody the legacy of these early architects of influence. Their models of power emphasize not the destruction of opposition, but the cultivation of understanding. When we trace these principles through time, we see their reflection in the movements for education, equality, and representation that define the modern era. The continued struggle for gender equity in leadership, from corporate offices to political institutions, is not only a fight for opportunity, but a continuation of the narrative they began. In studying their resilience, we also learn the importance of persistence over recognition. None of these women lived with the assurance that their names would be remembered. Murasaki wrote in a language that many of her male contemporaries dismissed. Hypatia taught in a climate hostile to her existence. Sappho's works were nearly erased by neglect. Yet they created not for acclaim, but because they understood the necessity of expression and knowledge. Their endurance teaches that progress rarely begins with applause, it begins with conviction. In every era, there are individuals who act without certainty of reward, who continue their work simply because it must be done. Their courage becomes the foundation upon which future generations stand. Today, the call to acknowledge their echoes is not an exercise in nostalgia, but a responsibility. Recognizing their contributions reframes the story of civilization as a shared creation rather than a narrow chronicle of conquest. It challenges the idea that power belongs only to those who hold titles or wield visible authority. When we recover the stories of women who shaped thought and culture, we gain a fuller understanding of how humanity has evolved. We also dismantle the silence that allowed so many others to remain unseen. Every recovered name, every rediscovered text, and every acknowledgement of forgotten influence enriches the collective story of who we are. The world still struggles with imbalance. Despite progress in rights and representation, gender inequality remains embedded in structures that shape education, work, and leadership. Women continue to face disparities in pay, recognition, and opportunity, as well as persistent stereotypes about competence and authority. Yet, within these challenges lies the same potential for resilience that defined the women of the past. The modern landscape, more interconnected than ever before, offers both new barriers and new tools. Technology, global communication, and social awareness provide avenues to challenge inequality in ways that were once unimaginable. But the lessons of endurance remain timeless: clarity of purpose, mastery of craft, and unyielding belief in one's own voice. From these figures, we learn that influence does not require perfection. Murasaki, Hypatia, and Sappho were not mythic beings untouched by fear or doubt. They were human, flawed, and uncertain. Their greatness came from their persistence in the face of those flaws. This understanding can guide the present generation, which often holds impossible expectations of success and confidence. Leadership, they remind us, is not about infallibility but about commitment. The measure of influence lies in consistency, in returning to one's purpose despite resistance or failure. That resilience, the willingness to continue, is the thread that links their lives to ours. The world of today, though transformed by technology and progress, still relies on the same human impulses that shaped their creations: the need to understand, to connect, and to express. The drive that led Murasaki to capture the fleeting beauty of emotion, that pushed Hypatia to defend reason against ignorance, that inspired Sappho to sing of love and longing, is the same force that fuels today's thinkers, artists, and innovators. When modern scientists challenge established paradigms, when writers explore new perspectives, and when leaders advocate for compassion and justice, they echo the courage of those who came before them. Their spirits live not in monuments, but in the choices we make to question, create, and care. Acknowledging their echoes also means recognizing how easily history forgets. Many societies still undervalue women's contributions in subtle ways, through omission, through lack of citation, through the persistence of stereotypes that frame male achievement as universal and female success as exceptional. Correcting this imbalance requires more than commemoration. It requires integration. Their stories should not exist as footnotes to the achievements of men, but as central elements of the human story. Education plays a crucial role here. When students learn about the empresses, philosophers, and poets who shaped civilization, they inherit not only facts but frameworks for thinking. They learn that power takes many forms, that intellect is not bound by gender, and that culture grows richer when all voices are heard. There is also a personal dimension to this acknowledgement. Each generation must decide how to carry forward the legacies it inherits. The women of the past handed down not only inspiration, but responsibility. Their example challenges individuals today to ask how they might use their own positions, whether in art, science, politics, or everyday life, to continue expanding the boundaries of inclusion and understanding. The revolution they began was not a single event, but an ongoing movement toward awareness. Every act of recognition, every instance of fairness, every decision to amplify another's voice contributes to that movement. The persistence of inequality can make progress seem slow, but history teaches that change is cumulative. The influence of Hypatia was carried through her students to later generations of scholars. Murasaki's literary sensibility shaped centuries of Japanese culture. Sappho's poetry inspired entire traditions of verse that continue to evolve. Likewise, modern acts of acknowledgement build upon one another. Each voice added to the chorus strengthens it. The momentum that began with isolated acts of defiance now gathers in global movements for gender equity, education, and representation. What once required individual courage now calls for collective commitment. To honor their echoes is also to expand their reach. We must continue seeking the stories that remain hidden in archives, in oral histories, in the lives of women whose names have not yet been recovered. The past is vast and unfinished, filled with voices waiting to be heard. The ongoing task of history is not only to record events, but to restore them to balance. By uncovering and celebrating these lives, we ensure that the silence which once veiled them does not return. Each discovery, whether a recovered text, a restored artwork, or a reinterpreted legacy, adds another thread to the fabric of human memory. The continuing revolution of acknowledgement is not limited to scholarship. It extends into culture, politics, and daily life. When films, books, and art highlight forgotten or overlooked figures, they challenge the narratives that shaped perception for generations. When organizations promote diversity in leadership, they embody the principles of inclusion that these historical women modeled through their courage. When individuals listen to and support each other across differences, they reaffirm the understanding that power grows when shared. The revolution persists not through confrontation, but through recognition, through the quiet but transformative act of seeing. It is also important to note that acknowledging these women does not diminish the achievements of men. It enriches the entire human record. The aim is not to replace one story with another, but to complete the picture. A balanced view of history reveals that progress is rarely the work of a single group. It is the result of constant collaboration between visible and invisible hands, between those who lead openly and those who guide quietly from behind. By embracing this complexity, we gain not only fairness but truth. As the world continues to confront new challenges, social, environmental, technological, the lessons of these silent revolutionaries remain vital. They teach that progress depends on imagination and perseverance, that empathy is a form of intelligence, and that the pursuit of knowledge is an act of moral courage. Their examples encourage us to value substance over noise, purpose over pride. They remind us that real change often begins with small acts of clarity, a word written, a question asked, a truth spoken despite resistance. To listen to their echoes is to listen to ourselves. The same human capacity for creativity and resilience that carried them through adversity resides in us. Their stories invite reflection on what kind of legacy each person will leave behind. Will it be one of silence or of expression, of conformity or of courage? The choice belongs to every generation, and the past offers both warning and hope. The echoes of Murasaki, Hypatia, Sappho, and the many others before them continue to guide that choice. Their lives illustrate that even when denied visibility, influence finds a way to persist. The ideas they set in motion still move beneath the surface of modern culture, shaping how we write, reason, and feel. Their work teaches that the measure of power lies not in its noise, but in its endurance. They have become part of the world's conscience, reminders that the pursuit of truth, beauty, and understanding is itself an act of leadership. As we look to the present and future, the task is to continue their unfinished work, to seek out the unheard, to recognize the unseen, and to ensure that silence never again becomes the default state of half of humanity. Each acknowledgement, each act of learning, is a step toward that goal. The revolution they began, though centuries old, still unfolds with every story told, every perspective included, and every barrier broken. Their echoes are not distant. They are the pulse of the ongoing human story, urging us to listen, to remember, and to continue.